Welcome. Welcome everyone to History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps study group discussion. Today in the speakers room we have Nordalian Plebs, Rogerio Marx, and Graham Pong. Hello guys. Yeah, we will be discussing episodes from 4 to 7. Yeah, take it out.
I would like to take the advantage to, in the tradition of the ancient poets, to ask the muses for inspiration for what we are going to attempt, which is we're going to delve into unfamiliar territory. We will try to convey and comment on what is known, drawing inspiration mainly from Peter Adamson's work on history of philosophy without any gaps. And we will talk about three of some of the most ancient philosophers known, after the ones we discussed yesterday.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nerdal.
Looking forward to it. So today we'll be discussing Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and Parmenides, if I'm not mistaken. Three gentlemen over there, and yeah.
So
don't know. I guess we can jump in.
Yeah, they are also from the current day coast of Turkey, just as the ones we discussed yesterday, Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, and Xenophanes. And these guys, Pythagoras originated from Samos, an island just off the coast of Western Turkey, while Heraclitus is from Ephesus, which is a little bit northward from the city of Miletus, which was the hometown of the most of the guys from yesterday. While Parmenides, he flourished in Ilia, which is in southern Italy. So I'm not sure if I'm remembering correctly. But it's possible that Parmenides also originated from Western Turkey, Ionia, but he traveled and established himself in Elea in southern Italy. And so we are dodging mainland Greece very thoroughly, which is funny because it seems like all the really interesting intellectual action is starting at the outskirts, at the how should we say it, the outer rim of the galaxy, so to speak. This is where things get interesting in terms of brilliant ideas, and only later will we talk about things getting hot in mainland Greece.
Yeah, cool. So, study group, right? So, these three thinkers are covered in 4 episodes by Peter Adamson, and they're interesting people. Perhaps like the most interesting of the three is Pythagoras, if only because of all the myth and legend surrounding him. But all three had quite interesting things to say, and yeah, as a group, maybe we can think about what are the things they said that resonate with us or that are difficult to understand, or maybe stuff that we'd like to summarize of them just to try to sink it into memory a little bit. And yeah, I guess for the audience we can repeat it a little bit, but I think Peter Adamson does a really good job of actually teaching the material. So for viewers, probably the quality of teaching would be better listening to Peter Adamson than having us teach the thinking of these thinkers. So we're just here to discuss the stuff we've studied so far. Study group discussion.
So I would like to kick the ball a bit here in terms of what some of the unavoidable characteristics attributed to Pythagoras, again emphasizing that since we are listening from Pythagoras' life through several removes, through Plato and Aristotle, and then further Neoplatonist thinkers and medieval scholars, etc. So we have to take it all with a grain of salt and realize that there were pressures. For instance, as Adamson relates, that while early Christianity was flourishing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD or Common Era, there was a lot of pressure in the Greek world, in the philosophers and priests of the pagan religion, to address the rapid spreading of Christianity. And in Adamson's words, Pythagoras was an easy figure to kind of use, instrumentalize. If he was already enshrouded in myth, probably they went put the pedal to the metal, and further put a load of myth onto this man. It's kind of like 8 centuries after his life in this time, and so there it is really hard to distinguish what was really accurate in his life and what was added afterwards. But things that are really outrageous are most likely added after the fact. But things that are possibly things that are ideas that are really from his life is he possibly was the first one to coin the word philosophy, which comes from 2 Greek words, philos and sophos, which means love and wisdom or truth. And so the person claiming he's a philosopher is a lover of wisdom or a lover of the pursuit of truth. He also was known to be the first to make philosophy into a way of life, to associate philosophy with math and music, which has geometrical and harmonic characteristics. And he is claimed to think that there was harmony within the human soul.
Like a musical harmony. Yeah, so I quite like the rigor that Peter Anderson teaches with making sure that we understand that, like, whatever is said about Pythagoras is really, there was a school of followers called Pythagoreans, and there's some consensus, but not complete consensus, among them of what they attributed to Pythagoras. And they attributed to him some things that are not credible, like being able to soothsay angry bears that were mauling villagers and speaking to rivers and stuff. So some fantastical things were attributed to him also. But yeah, the philosophical way of life, like a life dedicated to the cultivation of wisdom, has been attributed to him as being the first example of that. And I really quite like some of the stuff about music and the soul that was attributed to him. So it's attributed to him noticing that different musical harmonies result from specific mathematical ratios. For example, the length of a string in a lyre, if you divide it by half, you get an octave. If you divide it by half again, you get another octave. And so ratios like there are some other ratios to that. I actually forget now the exact details from, but some fairly pleasant or tidy mathematical ratios result in pleasant sounding musical harmonies. And they attributed to a theory that the soul is a kind of harmony within the body, and attributed to him the ability to calm people down by playing them the right kind of music, which doesn't seem all that fantastical, because music can have a very calming effect. That's well documented in many other traditions where the calming effects of some kinds of music is well noted. So yeah, the link between mathematics and music and souls, and even like the whole universe, is quite interesting to me. Also attributed to him the belief that the universe is somehow made out of numbers. So a great reverence for both the fundamental nature of number and also like a symbolic reading of number. This may be some of the things we know about the symbols attached to numbers or the symbology attached to numbers, maybe more about the followers than Pythagoras himself. But so the one example I remember is that 2 was supposed to be, I think, symbol for a woman and 3 for a man, or other way around.
Or the other way around.
Other way around. And then 5 becomes the symbol for marriage because it's the addition of the 2. I guess stuff just strikes me as a little less interesting than the noting of the connection between music and affective states, and also between like mathematical ratios and music. And yeah, Adamson makes the point that today there are physicists who consider mathematical objects at the foundation of physics. And so there are some echoes in modern day physics of the kind of ideas similar to the idea that number is somehow fundamental to physical reality. So those are all like really interesting ideas to play with. Some of them, like the fundamental nature of the universe, a little difficult to test, or for me to imagine how one might test that. Others, like that people can be calmed down by music, easier to test, easier to verify. And yeah, some strange ethical ideas too.
Yeah.
And in Crash Course World History or Philosophy, the presenter made a big deal of it. That Pythagoras was noted to be a vegetarian, but he considered it unethical to eat beans. And how strange it is for a vegetarian to not eat beans. Like it's a very rich source of protein, but for a vegetarian to give up, it's a little odd. That's some odd ethical ideas that's difficult to explain. And Peter Adamson points out that for the ancients, a lot of those ideas were also difficult to explain. So they really know how he came up with these ethical teachings.
There is an attempt to explain his reluctance to eat beans because the beans looked like human embryos when they were ripe. And so he thought that possibly there was a soul in those beans as well, like they are in humans. And he seemed to be really mindful of minimizing suffering to beings possessing souls because of his concept of reincarnation. There is even an anecdote Adamson conveyed of it's possibly a fabrication, but the story goes that someone was harming a puppy, and Pythagoras heard his cries, and he said, "Stop! I can recognize the voice of a friend of mine in this puppy's cries." So it's probably a later fabrication, but it makes sense in the context of Pythagoras thinking about human souls as being as immortal as numbers are. It raises the question whether human souls, individuals, are rational or irrational numbers. And this concept of immortality of the soul, which I think was when Adamson in his series mentions the concept of dualism for the first time, which is a really big idea, irrespective of it having any bearing or not to reality, which in my position, all bets are off. I would also like to address the music thing. It seems that Pythagoras was versed in a discipline of physics that we now call acoustics. And so by dividing a string in half, the vibrations that will course through that string and another string double its length, the waves will overlap nicely, and that will be pleasing to the human audio processing part of the brain, because the brain has less trouble filtering out any noise. It produces pure signal, or more pure signal. So I thought that would be worthy of mention as well, because it's a correlation to stuff that, or knowledge that it's contemporary right now, and also people that study the brain, neurons firing, etc. The neurons fire at different rates at different periods, and it might have to do with when sensory input is harmonious. It might be even if only on the long term of repeated exposure, to help harmonize the internal signaling of the brain as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. To be clear, I think if a string is halved in length, the frequency would double, the wavelength would halve.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And I actually think there's an interesting connection. Sorry, Cara. I want to.
I wanted to give voice to Graham as well. You guys just bouncing ideas. Like, sorry to interject. Graham?
Oh, thank you, Cara. No, I was enjoying listening to them. They brought up some good points. And one of that I associate with a lot of these early philosophers is this is the first time this stuff is being written down. And that makes a difference. And I see that whole writing, that this is the attempt to bring more of this knowledge to the general populace, where before it had basically been reserved to the royals and the elites. And one of the big things I notice about Pythagoras is, again, he's the first one that really wrestled with the idea of the soul. And it's like he's interjecting the individual into philosophy for the first time, and with this whole transmigration of the soul. And it definitely kind of seems to be like that's where the dualism is starting to come in, is because it's the self and the other inherently, and as soon as you throw the self or an individual into the system, you immediately have the two parts. And also the fun little fact is the way that the Pythagoreans responded to irrational numbers, where they basically decided to kill people who understood it as opposed to admit that that was the truth. So those are sort of my insights from there. So I'm going to tag out here.
Yeah, it's like math is making a kind of a personal assault on people's feelings at the time. They wanted to represent pi as a ratio between two numbers, which is where the word rational or irrational comes from, because whether numbers are represented as a ratio or not. And they were distraught by their failure at representing pi or other irrational numbers as a ratio between two simple numbers.
Yeah, in their defense, probably that had some deep symbolic significance that was very distasteful to them. So they were attaching symbolic meaning to mathematical things. And yeah, probably. So the inability to express it as a ratio might seem to say that there's something about math that's disharmonious, and that disharmony may have been related to ethical badness or evil, and some math throwing evil in their face where they believe the fundamental nature of the universe is good or something. I'm completely speculating.
Or a crack in the concept that the universe is utterly divine and perfect for being so. Yeah.
I wanted to say about the soul, I'd like to also, again speculating, try to imagine kind of rationale for believing in reincarnation, especially noting that this theory of the soul, which is a different kind of theory of the soul that we've seen Thales has with his defining soul as that which can initiate movement. Here, soul is conceived of as a kind of harmonious order of something, and analogous to music, and also can be moved by music. And so the way, what can happen is if you have two strings next to each other, you play one string, the other string can actually begin to vibrate in harmony or attune to the vibration of the first string.
It's sympathy, right?
Something like, yeah, sympathy. And like, so that can happen in physical things. And so you can actually see the harmony in one string move from one physical thing to another physical thing. And you can also see the harmony in a beautiful melody move from an instrument played by a musician to like the emotional state of a human being. And you can also see, if you watch for it, in a group of people who are emotionally attuned, they'll be empathizing with each other. So if there's some laughter that breaks out, the laughter is contagious, and the laughing harmony will move through a group. And like if people get angry, like a group can rile each other up, and the angry harmony or the angry emotion can move through a group. So it can look like, depending on your conception of a soul, as if souls can move between bodies. Like an angry soul can move from one body to another body, or a laughing soul can move from one body to another body. And this notion that whether a person dies or lives, or like one being dies or lives, the laughing soul will continue, and the angry soul will continue, and loving and caring souls will continue, and inquisitive souls will continue.
Yeah, yawns are also very contagious. When I had my son, I had this question in my mind, because I noticed that I was yawning a lot in front of him shortly after his birth, and I noticed the yawns weren't being contagious to him. He was completely immune, or at least he didn't have the neural hardware prepared to be contagious by yawns. And it was only after a few months that I noticed the yawns becoming contagious. So I kind of had this question as well, this philosophical and natural physics question, and also human nature question about also physiology, etc. And I only tested on one single individual, but it was really telling that some things that we take for granted, that seem like innate behaviors, they might take some time to emerge after birth. So, and also to address the immortality of the soul and transmigration of the soul things. It's an idea that many people want to believe, honestly, but that doesn't make the idea any more true or any more false. The thing is, each person can really only know for sure at that fatal moment, at the end of this traversal between birth and death.
I would like to add the way I see dualism applied to the harmony as well. So, just like, again, speculation, Pythagoras is like more myth than a man. Somehow, like a lot of things are attributed to him. But, so that idea that soul is something like that is immortal, indestructible, like completely different, and the body is something very destructible, temporary. But the two of them, they are like this thing that creates life. And the music and the harmony, also like whatever, man and the woman, the two of them, they create this harmony. Then in actual melodies, when you combine things that are aligned, again, creates this harmony. I think there is this idea that everything seeks this kind of yin-yang sort of dance, and he had this sense of it. That stood out to me somehow. Graham?
No, I was going to sit there and similar observation where it's the like Anaximander was talking about the in and out of the Tao kind of thing, and that's sort of where the dualism comes in. It's again, we're jumping at philosophers, but sort of the Hegelian dialectic, where you have the thesis, the antithesis is the duology, and then you have the synthesis as the unity between the two, and your harmonies kind of like the dance in between the two parts of the duology. And the other aspect that I see the soul arriving from is that idea of the same duology where you have the two parts, say night and day, become, day and night becomes like an entire day. It's not just the light, it's not the dark, but it's the union of the two. And you have like the sequence of days will become a year. And then it's the idea of a life and death being a duality of the soul. And it's the idea that I see that as some of the idea where they're coming from, where if you have the life and the death, then you're probably going to have as part of a larger part. And that's where the soul was sort of deriving from. It's sort of where I'm grokking it. What do you guys think? Tag.
That's exactly my sense.
I think it's a question that, in my perspective, it is unknowable about the properties of this aspect of ourselves that might or might not be immortal or extended beyond the death of our physical bodies. Even though there are many traditions that emerged independently, like not just Pythagoreanism, but also Platonism that drew inspiration from Pythagoras, and also other Eastern traditions like Buddhism as well, and Hinduism, that they also mentioned the immortality of the soul, and the ancient Egyptians too, which it's probably likely, since Pythagoras is said to have visited ancient Egypt, where he might have picked up this idea that there is something that extends beyond life. Since the Egyptians, their culture was almost all focused on what comes after death, with all this embalming and etc., that they would prepare people really ritualistically for what comes after a life.
Yeah. So what I'd like to add to that is like the idea that someone could, like, there's somehow a storage of memory that survives the destruction of a person's body, an immaterial storage of memory that survives, that gets transferred not through any physical process, through some non-physical process to a different body, strikes me as implausible. Just as far as I can tell, like, information gets transmitted through physical processes, but then there are physical processes that can transmit memories from one person to another person. And even within a person, our memories of the past are largely reconstructions by the brain. So we don't have this pure snapshot of the past, and we're reconstructing it. And so, at least in the brain, the difference between a real personal memory and a memory that was implanted there by some kind of hypnotic process is like very scant. And so people can be taught memories of past lives as children, but it would have to be taught. It would be born with them. Truth be told, I don't even trust any of the memories I have from when I was 5 or younger, even 6 or younger, from when I was a little child. I doubt my current memories of those are very close to reality at all. Like, mostly reconstructions based on conversations with parents and things. So even within one lifetime, like, our memories are very fallible and questionable, and reconstructions. And there are ways in which a person can be led to create reconstructions, not of their own personal life, but of previous lives. So say that the sons of kings can be taught the history of the battles of the kingdom, and they can be, in vivid detail, be told personal stories of the lives of their parents. And I think a similar process than that can be used to raise a child to effectively have the memories as if they're a reincarnation of a previous soul. And that raises the question, like, what is a soul even? Like, if it's something like patterns of information, then a pattern of information as if it was a previous soul just is a pattern of information of a previous soul. So, like, there's some people who view souls like a simulation of a soul is a soul, because a simulation is a pattern of information and a soul is a pattern of simulation. Now, of information, whether you believe that or not is not what I want to convince anyone of. I just want to say that it's not an irrational view to think that the software that runs a general artificial intelligence, so like the kind we don't have yet but may very soon have, may run on 2 different machines and in effect be the same soul. So like the same intelligence can run on different machines. We can install the same software on different machines, on indefinitely many machines, and some of them may be destroyed and others may continue, so the software can survive, or the software can be stored and reinstalled on a machine later at another time. So if soul is something like software, then to think it can survive into the future after the destruction of a physical being that was storing that information isn't so ridiculous. It's actually not ridiculous at all. It's an interesting kind of angle to think about. But that it does depend on what we mean by what a soul is. Just on a last point, if in digital physics and even in this software as soul thing, fundamentally software on von Neumann computers is represented as numbers, so as sequences of zeros and ones, which can be interpreted as numbers. And so like there may be something very deeply correct about the idea that both soul is number and just as immortal as any number. Like you won't kill 3, just like you can't kill soul. And maybe like some of the digital physicists would say like the whole universe is number isn't such a crazy idea as well. There are like very serious physicists like Stephen Wolfram who has a similar kind of idea to this. And so they're like really interesting ideas to think about and speculate on. And I don't know if they're right or wrong, but they're cool.
One of the things that
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say, one of the things that jumped out there is, I think your reasoning is correct if you're sticking with a mechanistic approach, sort of Newtonian physics approach. And where I see a door opening is via quantum mechanics, that whole spooky action at a distance. And there you're dealing with implicitly a non-mechanistic approach that we don't entirely comprehend yet, which, again, anything you don't comprehend yet leaves the opening for what else you don't understand hiding within. And that's the everything you're saying could be right, and there's a lower level where the soul exists at that we just don't entirely grok at the moment. Tagging on that.
Yeah.
There's
I'm really confused by the physics of spooky action at a distance. Like confused enough that I'll take a skeptical stance until I get super fast internet thanks to spooky action at a distance.
Yeah,
Or get beams into your head.
It's really enticing to reinterpret these ideas about patterns being the soul, or harmonies being the soul, as having a correspondence with what we are currently discovering at the edge of physics, with these behaviors that that the most fundamental particles of matter seem to assume, with all this uncertainty and connectivity between particles, even through vast distances. There's this idea that 2 particles could be in a superposition, as they say, and even if they are at opposite edges of our galaxy, if we change one to be facing down, in a sense, and the other one will immediately, without any lag due to the distance, face upward. And so some people who enjoy science fiction posit that in the future, if we have a galactic civilization, we could have instant communication due to this quirkiness of the universe, the function of the universe. But this is really difficult. It's a really difficult subject, quantum mechanics, because even people that are within the field, like Richard Feynman. He would say, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics. Even these really strange behaviors that are observed in the super cliche and super referenced experiments of the double slit. It's called the double slit experiment, where if you don't observe it, particles behave as waves, and if you do observe the particles, they kind of collapse into particles and stop interacting with each other as waves. They stop interfering and stop making an interference pattern where they land on a screen. And so this is extremely frustrating, because when we set out since ancient times to figure out the universe, we wanted to figure out the universe as non-interfering observers that could passively measure and passively look at what's happening, taking our recording and then making sense of whatever is recorded of the data, be it small stuff or nearby on Earth, or big stuff in the vast cosmos above our heads. And so when we observe something and by observing, it seems that it is changing. That is really a frustrating thing indeed. But some interpretations suggest that this might have to do with the fact of human consciousness or awareness of something that is happening, and influences it by necessity, because deriving or drawing from Hindu myth, we have a kind of soul that they call Atman, and it's connected to a bigger soul that they call Brahman. And if we are interacting with the bigger soul through some of these experiments, for instance, we are kind of influencing the overall soul, so as to speak. But this is extremely hypothetical, very this is speculative, and so we have no idea what is the correct interpretation of these most quirky behaviors of nature called quantum effects. I would also like to propose maybe read some passages attributed to Pythagoras. Who wants to start?
Yeah, we can do that.
There's one here available for anyone to check it out. It's really short.
In the private chat, please.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm lazy. I'll go first. Pythagoras from Ocalis. I don't know what that abbreviation is. Page 20. The first triad consists of beginning, middle, and end. I see this as it's, again, one of those trinities, the triad, that happens all the time. It's the tripartition of the earth into, sky, underworld, and basically surface sort of thing. And here, you also have, time in the past, present, future. And this is sort of seems to be Pythagoras echoing that sort of thing, tagging on that.
Yeah, the Pythagoreans like the triangles, right? And the triads and trees. So interesting to ponder whether by first he means sort of in the sense of creation, or first in the sense of priority, on what sense he means first. So whether like the most important triad to keep in mind is this arrow of time from start, middle to end, or whether the first thing that came into being was time. Not sure. Maybe both. Maybe neither.
It's also tempting to compare this quote from one of the foundational or fundamental aspects of Hindu philosophy as well, or cosmology, what have you, where they talk about the three main principles that they call, that's also forming a triad, that they call the Trimurti, which involves creation, they call Brahma, preservation, they call Vishnu, and destruction, Shiva, which are deities. But it also parallels what we can observe in nature as well. We have flourishing, we have the homeostasis of life, the preservation of life while it exists in a dynamic equilibrium. And then we have decomposition of biological matter, which is mostly handled through fungi and microbes. And this cycle goes on and on.
Yeah, that is an interesting comparison.
The other one that I'm picking up on is the idea of echoing back to Anaximander in the Tao here, where he's talking about the beginning being like the departure from the Tao, the middle, the staining part, and the end, the returning part, which is, I'm also grokking with that's corresponding to the whole Hindu Trimurti. And on that one, I'm just going to throw a fun fact. I just sort of sum it up with Dattatreya. He's all the three in one. Tag.
Yeah.
We also
Sure,
have
sure.
another one here.
Well, I was going to suggest we've been talking about Pythagoras for about 40 minutes. Shall we move on to Heraclitus, maybe?
Yeah, I'm seconding it.
Yeah. We need to give attention to this second most wisest guy. Sure.
second most wisest guy.
Yeah, he's also pretty wise, really engaging. I really thought him really engaging in his Peter Adamson's episodes.
Yeah, I like both episodes on him, and he seemed to me like an entertainer. I especially found of his one-liners. He's like a stand-up comedian before stand-up comedians. Somehow, my sort of guy. Also, very much fond of fire. That's my short introduction. Take it out, guys.
Yeah, a fiery guy.
A fiery guy. Yeah, so compared to some of the other elements that were proposed to be fundamental to the universe, Heraclitus had his own one, which is fire, which is different from water and the void and air some of the others had so far. Also interesting to speculate why fire. Also interesting to note that I think Peterson explains that he had a slightly different conception of fire than we have, Heraclitus saying now, as some kind of a fast, dry movement, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. So like lots of things could be fast, dry movement that we wouldn't consider fire, but then Heraclitus would consider fiery. So almost something like high kinetic energy. That's devoid of moisture somehow. I don't know. Different way to look at the world than what we have.
There's a really nice quote on that. Go ahead, Graham.
I was going to say, one of the takes that I got off of that one is with fire, Heraclitus is bringing in an active element where it's everything is the sense of change, which was very much a part of his fundamental philosophy. And it's basically, it's like his criticism was the previous ones, they were great as a static description, but they didn't incorporate that transition between one state and the next. And I also see in a lot of senses, Heraclitus was kind of a precursor to some of the cynics later on, like Diogenes, who is also very much a stand-up comic with his one-liners as well. So tagging out on that.
I really gained appreciation for the one-liners, especially as a way to kind of engage with people that have nothing to do with philosophy, like young children and whatnot, who they might be caught unaware by someone saying the road that goes up and the road that goes down, they're the same road. It's the same thing. And so you say something that is odd, kind of like a Zen Buddhist koan as well. Probably they were aiming at the same kind of effect, making someone pause and figure out that maybe things that they are taking for granted of being non-contradictory are extremely contradictory, and so it's a nice chance to revise our precepts, our axioms. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That maybe a possible way to shake someone awake who's just mindlessly doom scrolling on Twitter. They may see something interesting that way. I really like. He had a guest who's a real expert on Heraclitus, Emma McCabe, Professor Emma McCabe, and she seemed to explain that what she thinks Heraclitus was doing with the one-liners was really trying to encourage or inspire people to do some thinking, to come to their own insights. And so he gives these kinds of riddles and paradoxes, not to forcibly make an argument, but to get people to think the sorts of thoughts that if they did think through them, they would come to insights. And especially insights into the way language works, into the way people speak. And yeah, so a lot of these things he would do would be seemingly contradictory, but she thinks it's a mistake to worry about him undermining, say, is it the law of the excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction in logic that says a proposition can't be both true and false at the same time. So a lot of his little riddles have this look to them as if he's saying something is both true and false at the same time. But then he also has riddles where he would rephrase it to like resolve that seeming contradiction. And she explains that like often the resolution comes in using language in a more qualified, nuanced way. And it's a very common mistake, even still today, to speak in over general terms, to make claims that, like, into those broad general claims, you could actually make both claims. And if you filled in the details for either, it would be true. But people speak in shorthand. So in shorthand, they say something and they mean something more specific than what the words they actually use. The actual words they wrote mean something much more general than what they intend to communicate. But it's shorter and quicker, so they're just kind of winging it and getting a rough version out there. And so you could do the opposite claims and fill in different details, and you get two sentences that are both true. But it's because like the difference is in the details, and that would actually make the general claims mistaken, or like at least problematic, and maybe encouraging people to speak in more qualified terms rather than in generalities.
But it's a way of engaging the crowd as well. Like a crowd does heavy lifting with the projections. So when you give just this sort of mosaic, people can infer their own things. It kind of makes him more engaging. Though, like that, I promised myself not to joke about the double pronunciation of Heraclitus. But it's a riddle for me. How exactly do we pronounce Heraclitus? Because he is pronounced differently when you try it in Greek. Should I say it? Just to water this conversation.
Go ahead.
It's Heraclitus. That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
I know.
I
Not
just
funny.
summed that up. I just summed that up with Kara. Whichever pronunciation I choose is going to be the wrong one, and go with it.
No, not the self-deprecation. No,
I'm going for the humor, like Heraclitus.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he really liked to shove on people's faces that they are wrong in so many levels that they are unaware of, by showing, for instance, the limitations of language, how language can be subject to interpretation, drastically different interpretations even, which is amusing. He would like to say things like seawater, healthy for fish and healthy for men. And I imagine him making a severe expression while he was addressing people in his town, saying things like this. Or donkeys prefer garbage to gold. And then people would be perplexed. What do you mean? You're supposed to be a wise guy. Why are you saying these apparently strange things, these apparently contradictory things? And then if people really wanted explanation, he would open up to the explanation of what he was thinking about, which is for the study of Heraclitus maybe frustrating, because we have many of these one-liners, but we don't have his own commentary of what he was aiming for. We can only try to guess. Like M.M. McCabe, the scholar who was a gracious guest to Peter Adamson in the second episode on Heraclitus, she explained that she studied one of his one-liners, and she figured out a nice and a nice correction for it. So before it had a kind of a negative, it was saying even the posset or barley drink separates if it is not stirred. And she simplified it to a more concrete and direct meaning by saying the moving posset stands still. And what she thinks Heraclitus meant was there are some things that have the attributes of only being stable in a dynamic equilibrium, which is if you mix up this barley drink with cheese, which is has a lot of fat in it, if you let it still, it will separate. The cheese will go to the bottom, and it won't work as the intended drink for them. I cannot realize, I cannot fathom why they would drink this thing, but the ancient Greeks seem to appreciate it. A really strange drink indeed, but for it to work, it needed to be stirred, and it would only be as such as that drink, as stable as the definition of a posset, while it was stirring.
No, I like that one. That echoes his moving river sort of concept. One of the things that I notice with Heraclitus' wordplay is he's basically playing the game where as soon as you make one assumption, that carries inherent implications. And he's using examples where as soon as you choose it, he can use it against you. You know, sort of like with the race between, Achilles and the tortoise sort of thing. Where as soon as you decide on a state of being, he can use that against you. And if you'd gone the other way, he had an argument as to how that would work against you as well, is how I kind of see Heraclitus playing. In a sense, he's playing unfair with the idea of choice and assumptions. Tagging.
Just one aside, this thing of the tortoise and Achilles, I believe it's from the other thinker. I think Zeno.
You're right. I jumped ahead.
But it's okay. It's okay. Also, he had a quote that is a pun that only worked in ancient Greek. He said, "The bow, its name is life, its work is death." But in ancient Greek, bow had the name bios, which is the Greek name for life, which is where we have the name for biology. He also really liked to use the word logos, which is one of the, according to Adamson, one Greek word that is really hard to translate because it has many meanings. Would one of you like to address this?
Yeah, I can pick up on a couple of things. For one thing, like we haven't said out loud Heraclitus' most famous quote, which is that a man cannot step into the same river twice. Something like that from memory. It's like the really famous quote from him. And then the logos thing. I mean, most of the time when Greek is compared to English, I've heard Greek having this like wonderful diversity of terms for which in English we only have the one word love. And because we only have this one word, it causes a lot of confusion because we actually use it to mean different things in different contexts. And I think similarly, but in reverse, in in English, we have a bunch of different terms that, for all those terms, the Greeks would use the word logos. So they have one term that they use for a bunch of different things. And so using any one of the English terms that logos might be used in could be misleading, because it could also be used to mean one of the other terms. So yeah, something is difficult to translate, but I guess similarly, love would be difficult to translate into Greek, because love is used in these many different ways in English that for the Greeks have different words for that. So kind of have to list, like, it might mean this in some contexts, it might mean this in other contexts, it might mean this in other contexts, like a long definition of what it might mean. But yeah, it became a very important term in Christianity, because it was more or less identified with God in certain passages. And so it has, for a lot of people, a religious significance beyond just the linguistic question of how was it used by Greeks. So I think one of the uses by Greeks was just the same way English people these days use word, without necessarily the religious connotation. But one of the translations of logos in the Bible is like the word. So one of the phrases in the Bible is, in the beginning there was the word, and people identify that the word with God. So it can be a little sensitive to try to pin down the meaning of logos too, because of how significant it is for some people. But an interesting word. Peter Anderson explains that it's the origin of where we get a lot of, for disciplines, they often end in ology. And in that sense, it means something like account. So astrology is something like an account of the stars, and anthropology is something like an account of humanity. And psychology is something like an account of the soul. No economenology. no account of economics.
Maybe that's why it doesn't work as well as other ologies.
Yeah.
The one aspect for logos that it took me the longest time to incorporate for the ancient Greek meaning is the idea of it's an active agent. Because in English, its logic is very static, sort of a relationship in between two objects. And logos, it's inherently, for the Greeks, it was an active, it drove an action in the world. And it took me the longest time to see that was a major aspect of it. So tagging on that.
So it's the first time I'm hearing that, but it makes me think something like how Hegel conceived of a dialectical tension to be the source of historical movement. It sounds like you're saying similarly, at least in some use cases, the Greeks had this notion of logos, which is something like a meaning or a principle or an account or a logical ordering, being a driver of history, or like a driver or a causer of movement in history. Is that right?
Yeah, it's in the sense of it's like a force, sort of like gravity and everything else. It was an abstract force that they saw acting in the world. Like, water runs downhill would be a manifestation of the logos.
It's so tempting to compare it to the Tao, which is also a kind of an impermanent, active force that is always present.
Yeah.
No, that's a good one. And the other cognates I see is Dharma and Mot from Egypt as well, and Asha.
Yeah, or Brahma. All is Brahma. Brahman rather.
Important contrast with the Tao. Like, I think it was Lao Tzu who warned that the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the Greeks had this conception that one can speak the logos, like the logos can be spoken.
But still, Heraclitus said that. Let me check. Of the logos, which is always, men prove not to understand. So it is always, it is impermanent, it's ever present, but we cannot fathom it, probably because it's out of our realms of competence to understand. We can only see it, experience its effects, but we cannot grok it fully, to use the word borrowed from Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. It's too over the top, it's too all encompassing for us to be able to grasp it. At least that's what I'm interpreting with this quote.
It's one of those things where we again give a frame and let the audience fill in the blanks with however they understand the word. Yeah.
The
I do
traditional,
like that quote. Yeah.
the work is left for homework for the interested.
Yeah.
I also really enjoyed one other quote by him that I will share for it to appear on the screen, which is, "Traveling on every path, you will not find the boundaries of soul by going. So deep is its measure." So it kind of seems to relate with the previous one about the logos, which is even just our soul is already in connection to the most sublime or highest property of the cosmos. It is by that virtue of being so connected to it, not entirely graspable by us.
Yeah, I'm interested in the boundaries of the soul that cannot be found. What kind of boundaries was he considering? Probably several senses of boundaries, if this other writing is anything to go by. But yes, having made an observation that, say, attitudes can spread through people, or your ones can be contagious, may be difficult to see a soul confined in one place, where you can say, beyond this physical space or beyond this physical object, the soul does not move. Or maybe it's like more abstract than that, like whatever account is given of the soul, it's always an incomplete account. Or whatever seeking is done to understand the soul, like in a more personal sense now, the seeking will always be incomplete. There will always be elements of the soul that remain hidden and remain misunderstood. So yeah, the riddles and quotes like that are fun to think about, and it's a nice prompt to speculate all kinds of things.
My take on what he's saying with that is closest to where you were at the end there, Nerdalian, is the idea that basically he's saying the soul is boundless. And the very idea of trying to find the boundary of the soul is a pointless act. It's like trying to find, the corner of a circle. And, he's again going with that play on with words. As soon as you're choosing the term boundary, you've now violated the idea of the soul, which points back to the concept of soul with an Anaximander and a parry on the boundlessness. So tagging on that.
There's also another one. I thought it's really interesting. It goes back to the fire thing and how he viewed fire. All things are exchanged for fire, and fire for all things, like gold for goods and goods for gold. So the fire, he expands on this idea of fire being fundamental by being the unit of currency, the most fundamental unit of currency of the universe. And it seems to me that he might be talking about energy. It would make so much sense, because contemporary physics says energy is the currency of the universe, thermodynamics.
Yeah, like even that that dry fast motion it sounds more like energy than what we would think of as the process of combustion these days. And so the process of combustion is just a visible, like a particularly like visually striking example of this kind of energy. And yeah, other forms of energy. I'm not sure. I think in modern physics there are several kinds of energy, isn't there? Do they exchange? Like, does gravity exchange into electromagnetism?
the theory is they're all interchangeable. When you get to the unified force, they're having trouble pulling gravity in. They've got electromagnetism and the weak force to get all together.
There's three forces, and then gravity is odd one up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gravity is for some physicists not regarded as a true force, but this is, I think, a really big tangent.
It's ununderstood. Gravity, it's not well understood till this day. It's just like everything is a theory. Nothing is completely proven about gravity. I wanted to say about ever-changing nature, this kind of transient way that he even talks about. As a coming back to you can't step into the same river twice, and it was built on further, though you're not the same man anymore, and it's not the same river, because it's a constant movement, it's a constant change. And even our words, even logos itself, it's a forever changing kind of definition. Like it keeps changing from one brain to the other, because everyone kind of adds a little bit onto it, even though there is this general idea of what it is, but yet still everyone understands it slightly differently. So like he always plays with those kind of movement and change in his quotes, let's say.
And the translations from his one-liners, as you've mentioned, no man can step in the same river twice. Another translation, different waters flow over those who step in the same rivers. So they are the same rivers, but they are kind of subjected to change, and things are different, but they are all part of one at the same time, which was really striking for me. I was not expecting this from Heraclitus, that Peter Adamson mentions him as the very first monist from ancient Greece. I was always thinking it was the next guy, Parmenides.
I was going to say, what jumps out at me on the river is Heraclitus is playing with basically the definition of river itself in almost a Zen kind of way, where the nature of a river is to have flowing water. And it's like you can't have a river without the flowing water. So it's like he's parsing out, two sides of the inherent definition of river. Tagging on that.
Yeah, and so I think Emma McCabe explains that a part of that is intentional. Or she takes him to be doing that intentionally, not in order to deceive or confuse people, but to highlight to them that the ways they've been speaking may have been confused, and to prompt them to clarify their thinking to this kind of point where, we're using river in different senses. And like switching between the two senses makes it look like there's a logical contradiction. So let's be really clear about this sense of river and really clear about a second sense of river. And in both of those senses, nothing strange is going on, nothing contradictory is going on. But if we speak less clearly, it looks strange and contradictory.
I actually find it really funny that his contradictions find resolutions, ever-evolving resolutions to this day. So the way he spoke made him kind of travel and have arguments with the future philosophers, let's say, who are trying to get at what he was aiming at, let's say. So it's like never-ending conversation. And I'm pretty sure like in 1,000 years, he will still be asking the questions which will result in completely different interpretations and answers. Like amazing.
So what you're saying, Kara, is Heraclitus's words are an eternal flame still burning fire to this day.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's so beautiful. I wish I can write it down. Gorgeous. Thank you, Graham.
It will be recorded anyway, or it is, or was. It's gone. Yeah, once again, hearing not me, but the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. Regardless of what we say, of what our doctrines that we study or adopt say, regardless of what the wise sages say, the truth is the truth, and it's out there. To quote from X-Files, Fox Mulder.
But this is another example of where he's using language strangely. Like even in English, we use the word things for more than one. So it's like breaking the rules to say all things are one, to use both the word things and one. It's like against the rules of language to do that somehow.
Yet it still makes sense.
Contradictions.
I can give an example, a really curious example of these contradictions happening. So when we have a glass of water, we think it's just water, but it's not. The H2O molecules are constantly engaged in a kind of warfare where some molecules lose one of their hydrogens for a while. They become OH minus molecules, which are a kind of a base. And some of these protons that are loose, they spend some time loose, they are behaving as an acid, and they are constantly, the water molecules are constantly in this give and take of hydrogen ions. And so that's why a glass of water will dynamically respond to acids that we pour in it by having the hydrogens either released off from the water and behaving as more as acid, or if we add a base, it does the other thing around. And it's really interesting that Heraclitus was already grasping this concept of dynamic equilibrium that is ever present in nature, just with this commonplace example of the water molecule. It's very popular, the water molecule, among humans.
I like another contradiction that you mentioned earlier. Gold is rubbish for donkeys. See? There you go.
Yeah, call out for donkeys. They have their priorities set in order in a way that is correlates with Thomas More's utopia. I think I would suggest us moving on to Parmenides, because Heraclitus is probably is already tired of us commenting on him. Parmenides needs
I
to
don't
be...
think he can be even more tired, but we are exhausted of him.
So, but Heraclitus is having a rave in the grave. Talk about.
Nice.
So Parmenides, he's more of a southern Italian guy from Ilia in southern Italy. And there's this idea that Xenophanes, who we talked about, might have founded the school of Ilia, which is the school of the Eleatics. But it might also be the case that it was actually Parmenides who founded the school. But either way, Parmenides is a really big figure of the Eleatics, and also he's a really big figure of this idea of monism that Heraclitus was already mentioning.
He takes it a bit further than Heraclitus, though, doesn't he?
Yeah, he literally says, just to paraphrase him, that we can only talk about what is. It doesn't even make sense to talk about what is not. And it hints at either he's forbidding himself and his students to lie or talk about fictions, to only be truthful and talk about stuff that is and the gods that are accepted as reality, and completely by doctrine as kind of like an ethical precept to avoid talking about stuff that is not. But I think the most common interpretation is to say that even fiction, even like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, it really exists in a sense, at least in a metaphysical sense, as concepts. And so the unit of being of Parmenides, this perfect sphere, all-encompassing sphere of the cosmos, that encompasses both time and space, and we are only by virtue of our limited perspective experiencing time one slice at a time. But this unit of being has everything, including both the material world that we experience with our senses and the concepts that we can think about.
Yeah. Peter Adamson makes an important point, and he says, so far, it seems like Parmenides is the first philosopher who's genuinely an armchair philosopher, in the sense that he uses an argument delivered in the form of a poem to make a statement that seems to fly in the face of everyday observations, and says, well, the argument is sound, so your observations must be wrong. And forget your observations. It is the logic of the argument that you should trust. Observations are fallible and will get you into trouble. If you want to have true knowledge, you should trust in reasoning and logic, something like that. And then he goes to argue that nothing ever changes, which very apparently seems to fly in the face of everyday experience, and doesn't give much of an account of why everyday experience is wrong, or how we're deceived into believing things change when they don't. He just sort of uses this, it seems to me like some kind of linguistic trick, where he says it doesn't make sense to talk about things that aren't. And in general, in very general, for something to come into being, it would have to not be first and then come to be, but it doesn't make sense to say anything doesn't be or isn't. And similarly, for something to be destroyed, it would have to go from being to something that isn't, and isn't doesn't make sense. So things can't be created or destroyed, because it doesn't make sense to talk about things that aren't. And similarly, things can't change, because it would have to be one thing and not be something else, but that not being something else doesn't make any sense to talk about. And when it changes, it has to then not be the thing it was and be the thing it wasn't, but the wasn't doesn't make any sense to talk about. And so things can't be created or destroyed, and they can't change because of this thing that's a little difficult for me to accept, that it really doesn't make sense to talk about things that aren't. To me, plainly seems to make some kind of sense. Like I can make sense of things that aren't. So I'm not sure where Peterson, I think, explains, or Peter Adamson explains that there's some kind of explanation that talking about things that aren't leads to contradiction. But I have a suspicion it's one of these not real contradictions, that is either this kind of thing where he's messing with choice, or it's a vagary of language that makes it look like a contradiction, not a real contradiction. Anyway, like, interesting argument to try to dissect, to see what's wrong with the argument, because it, at least the way the poem's written, the argument is not easy to refute. Like it seems to turn on some finicky, tricky technical things that's wrong with it. But the conclusion seems fairly easy to refute. You start with a cup of tea, smash it, and then not have a cup of tea anymore.
Here's my way of looking at it. I sort of see Parmenides as trying to put out Heraclitus' fire. And it's a matter of almost like he had gotten sick of arguing with Heraclitus about things. And it's a matter of, I'm only going to discuss what you can show me. Is it sitting in front of me? Okay, we can talk about it. We're not going to talk about what it might have been before, what it might be. And it's like what Parmenides is doing is divorcing being and becoming, and saying we don't know about it's like, I don't know where this cup came from. I'm not going to say anything about it. It's right here, like right now. You know, once it's smashed, it's smashed. That's all I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the cup that it was. And that's sort of where I see he's basically limiting himself in discussion to what can be shown in the present moment. And saying, well, we don't know anything else, and this is all I'm going to say. Shut up, Heraclitus. Tag.
it's also worthwhile to reference the style and form in which the poem was written. It's a really tall tale of involving a trip to the abode of a goddess, and it is the goddess who conveys these kinds of deep, profound wisdom on the cosmos to Parmenides. It seems that when this poem was being read in Parmenides' time, probably by himself, to younger adults or even teenagers, this tale would be really appealing to them. It would be really, they would be really impressed by this tall tale. So it seems like it would be good for marketing purposes.
And yeah, another way in which it's good for marketing and playing to the crowd is he's saying regular people, like the losers and plebs, will not be able to see this divine wisdom that I'm about to teach you. It's only for the super elite that will be able to grasp this. And yeah, for someone seeking to find distinction for themselves, as is very common in younger men, teenage age men, or younger men, before they've earned their stripes, fighting to earn stripes, like this allure of a doctrine that will place them above the sheepish flock of others who don't understand the true nature of things. Be a really good way to draw attention to yourself, and then to make an argument that sounds valid but is, like, for tricky reasons invalid, to come to an outrageous conclusion, and then have these followers know this outrageous conclusion is a truth, and they already have preloaded that no one will appreciate their insight that this outrageous conclusion is a truth. Other people aren't smart enough to see the wisdom. So it's understandable why it survived. It's good marketing.
Yeah, I had the luck of finding an amateur philosopher from our day, and had a conversation, a recorded conversation with him on YouTube, and he studied by his own interest. He's called Twitterphone on Twitter, and it's really interesting to talk with him about Parmenides and the other Eleatics, and even the Chinese monists. And he has such a profound wisdom on them and knowledge that he even created a Choose Your Own Story website that is called, I think, Journey into Monism. So it's a really nice introduction to this idea of monism, and the very structure in which this content is made is like a unit of being as well, because you can go forward and backward in time, so as to speak, through the hyperlinks. And so, in a sense, going back to the teacup example, if we look at the universe as a perfect sphere in which all timelines are contained, the teacup is there imprinted into the sphere in a certain place and time for a certain duration of time. It's just that we are, by our limitation of experience, already experiencing the part of that timeline after the cup was imprinted, or in a remove of that cup, but it's still there in a sense. There's also this film called I don't remember the name, but it involves these alien beings, hexapods, that had a system of language that made them aware of time as being an all-encompassing time frame. I think it was Arrival. It's called Arrival. And I think maybe they were getting inspiration from monists like Parmenides. Yeah, exactly, the Arrival, Kara. Tagging out, as Graham likes to say.
No, Rifle's a great movie. That was based off of the Ted Chiang novella, science fiction writer who does fabulous stuff.
Is he from China by any chance?
I don't believe so. I want to say America, but I don't know. I just enjoy the writers, so
Yeah.
I don't always care about where they're from or anything
Yeah.
like that.
It's not that. It is more what could be the cultural context that he's drawing from, even if he wasn't raised or born within it. He might have drew inspiration from some of these philosophies or doctrines related to monism.
Oh, I'm sure he did. He pretty much mines everything. He has one where it's basically the Tower of Babel. They end up cutting a hole in through the heavens, and it basically floods everything and knocks the tower down. He has one about the homunculus. He's just alchemy. What was it? The Alchemist Gate. His stories are just, he picks almost a different genre each time, sort of almost like Quentin Tarantino with movies. Like, picks a different genre every time he wants to make a movie. So, but we're way off Parmenides, and I don't know. Somehow we'd make this into a monism, but
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Graham. You're quite a fan of the laws of form,
yes,
and fundamental to that system is the marking of a distinction that simultaneously marks something that is, and that's something that is not. Is that correct?
that's the way Spencer Brown explains it. Yeah, from a structural standpoint, it's dialectical monism is at the base. It's the idea that you can't express the monism. You can't have the naked monad. You can't have the naked monad. It can only be expressed as a duology. And by that, it becomes overloaded. So it's constantly going from the state of one to the state of multipleness. And again, it's consistent with Spencer Brown's structure. I don't know if he was ever aware of dialectical monism, though.
Yeah. So I was hoping maybe to relate that to this notion that it doesn't make sense to talk about that which is not, whereas in the laws of form, it seems that in order to get to logic and mathematics and computation, which we have, it's required that is included in the system. Like, it's a fundamental requirement of the system.
Right. The way that I understand it is, and again, this is going to be coming more into play when we get to Epimenides with his paradox, but it's the essence of, you have both is and is not as a conjoint antinomy. It's like the merging of the two opposites into one thing, and you can only have one of the two exhibit in this world. So it's like it's inherently joined at first, and then it splits apart, and then we're only dealing with what is.
Yeah, so I think Peter explains Parmenides saying something like, there are three ways we can talk about the world. There's this mode where we can talk about what is, or we could talk about what is not, and then, like, sacrilegiously, if you're completely out of your mind, you can talk about what simultaneously is and is not. I think that's what Peter explained. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it seems like it's very difficult to build mathematical computational systems when it's allowed that something both is and is not at the same time. Where I guess one exception would be like fuzzy logic, where things could be degrees of is and is not, and maybe if it's at 50% is, 50% isn't, or 0.5 is and 0.5 isn't, that'll count as both is and is not at the same time. And again, with the quantum mechanics things, there are like some of the math there seems to require that things both is and is not at the same time.
No, you're hitting it exactly right, because that's what happened when Aristotle split everything into inductive and deductive logic. And that was conquered in the 1800s with Charles Sanders Peirce, with his abductive logic, which does exactly what you're talking about. It's basically a probabilistic logic that's essentially similar to what fuzzy logic, the multivariate logic later on. And that Peirce is exploring the same thing as Spencer Brown. Spencer Brown acknowledges that as well. And it's this concept of the merging, and it's the Epimenides paradox, where, all Cretans are liars, said by a Cretan. Is that true? Is that false? And that's some of why Aristotle came down with that hard deductive, inductive, where we're just not going to deal with that one. Basically ruled it off limits from, humans thinking about until Peirce rehabilitated about 150 years ago. Tagging.
I would also like to address this idea of within software there being is not logical operations. We must also detail what the question is that these logic operations are responding with, is or is not. They are responding with, is that statement written in the code true for this specific environment? And so it might be true or might be false, but the entire code that is in the software exists. It is.
Exactly. You're dealing with the two levels, sort of like von Neumann with the DNA analysis, where DNA is the static list of codons, and then it's also the being in action when put into a different form. Tag.
Yeah. So I guess it's not the most interesting part to play, or the interesting game to play when studying the history of philosophy, to vote whether we agree with this philosopher or disagree with that philosopher. But something that I do find myself wondering, like, all the time, that I think is maybe an interesting game, is like when philosophers forcefully argue this point or that point, I like to ask myself, all right, suppose Parmenides is correct. Like, what practical implication does this have for how I live my life? And it's unclear. Sometimes when it's abstract enough, it's unclear that it even has practical implications at all, which may be the case here. But if Parmenides is something saying like what it a little bit sounds to me like that we can't speak of what is not, that seems to imply that in computer science it only makes sense to have ones but not zeros. It doesn't make sense to have an off gate. Like a gate can only be on, it can't be an off gate. So you can't build computers with just the one state, and it doesn't make sense to me that you can have a universe with just one state. But suppose all of the universe was just one state. How does that change what I do next? Does it change what I do next at all?
Can you do anything?
There's this concept.
If I believe when it seems like I'm doing something, I'm not really doing something, because doing something implies something's changing, but it's possible for anything to change. Say, all right, I'm living in an illusion that things are changing, and then I'm doing things. Like, what do I not do with that insight?
I was going to say, you sound like Parmenides there, tagging.
I sound like a clinically insane person to myself right now.
Parmenides and the guy that comes after Parmenides is even more maddening because of his paradoxes. We will go over his paradoxes and try to keep stay sane next time. But to try to address this idea of, okay, yeah, so everything is already set in stone. According to this poem of Parmenides, the unit of being is a perfect sphere. It's already a perfect creation. This has translated, I think, to later thinkers like the Stoics, who practice amor fati. They really do tell to themselves that existence is perfect, and everything that happens happens of necessity. It needs to happen. Even things that are perceived as atrocities, etc. They do mental gymnastics to reinterpret things that are perceivably bad in their lives as being something that they can repurpose as life lessons, as sources of wisdom, even from suffering. And also there's this other concept also from the Stoics, much later Stoics, interchanging between the Greeks and the Romans, that they would say that you have been assigned a role in your life, play your role as best as possible, because you cannot change that role. That role is not up to you. It was up to whatever higher power has put you on this existence. And you have kind of like a path that has been delineated for you. And so your role, your mission in life is to perform that life from birth to the grave.
Yeah, I could see how people might think that follows, but I don't see how that follows from the notion that nothing changes. Everything is just is, and everything is one, and unchanging one.
This is one of the interesting things about philosophy. There are many open questions that Parmenides leaves, especially as you really well highlighted about his practicality. What use could we make of this in our practical everyday lives? And hoping that we keep going on with this, I think that we will find through the network properties of wisdom and knowledge, of remembering Parmenides when we are studying these Hellenistic guys, Cynics, Stoics, Skeptics, and Epicureans. I think some of the things that Parmenides laid down might start making more sense.
It would be interesting to find out.
I was going to say, I'll play a little Heraclitus to Parmenides, and that's the idea, again, that he divorced becoming from being there. And it presented the problem of how is the great chain of being linked, and it's linked by becoming, in the sense of everything was, like Nerdalian was saying, everything was something before, it is now because of what it was before and became this. And by being what it is now, it's going to become something else after this. It's an inherently, again, the Heraclitus fire, there's this leapfrogging chain of being and becoming. And what, again, what I see Parmenides doing is basically saying, we're just not going to talk about that becoming because words don't capture it right. It's an inherent limitation on the idea of language and words, which are very harsh and structured. And again, like being, words are an expression of being, and you can't put becoming into words, but you can. It's part of your experience, though, is where I'm seeing it. And Parmenides is basically saying, we're just going to focus on the being because we can't say anything. And the other idea is the tripart, and again, I'm stealing this from Castaneda, is you have the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. And that's in the sense of, again, the true, the false, and the true false. Tagging.
Yeah, I think I said the things I wanted to say about Parmenides. Cara, do you have anything to add about the whole world in one bubble that never changes?
I mean, I want to add a little bit of, again, I want to return to the way of the truth on the way of opinion. Somehow, like the way they kind of form our understanding of reality, metaphysics of it. Like that's just wanted to throw it out there.
He is considered the father of metaphysics, according to Adamson's words. The first armchair philosopher, as Nerdalian pointed out. He really created a really groundbreaking system of concepts about what the world is, what it is. And there's another striking thing of the cosmos being already a perfect sphere, as we could interpret this poem by Parmenides, which is there is no space for creation or a creator, because nothing comes to being and nothing leaves being as well. This I learned from the friend I mentioned before, who already started studying these guys a few years prior.
I mean, since things in experience or our opinion of experience seem to come into being, and there are small letter creators, in the sense like there are potters and there are parents, might not then like a creator inside all of the being that doesn't change be similar to potters who are like just a part of the one thing rather than outside of it? So like a creator inside of being rather than a creator outside of being. Might still have that.
Yeah. It might be tempting to become frustrated with this. I know.
I was going to say my way of dealing with it is opinion is on the subjective level, and then you have more of the logos truth on the objective level. And you can switch levels and include them both in the sense of everybody's opinion, such that it is also true on an objective level. You just have to recognize that's like a variable amongst all the individuals, rather than a single direct opinion overall, where the direct opinion overall on the objective level is more like a law of science, like gravity or math kind of thing. And my resolution is basically the idea that objective reality is simply shared subjective reality. It's the invariance concept of what we can all agree upon. Tagging.
Nice. I was not going to bring Heisenberg into it, but that's what it reminded me of. It's like being. It's like the contradiction. Is it possible to be and not to be at the same time? Yeah, like let's say cat in a box.
But the hardcore monist guy would say they are both accounted for in this sphere. There are the timeline branches. The timeline branches into two. One of them has the cat living, the other has the cat dead. And even the timelines branching like crazy are all within this sphere of perfect being.
Nice.
I don't know if you have thought about that already.
No, but that's the point, right? Like it felt to me again interpretation of words that had been written 500 BC, like
Yeah. But so actually
yeah.
the timeline splitting is an interesting thing to bring up, because there, like, one way to answer Kara's question about can things be and not be is to split things into different timelines. Another one is to split them into multiple universes. And like William of Ockham basically introduced a principle in philosophy. It's a bad idea to multiply entities beyond what's necessary. And the question is, like, is it necessary to posit these multiple timelines and these multiple universes? Like, what do we get for that? It seems like we're inventing fantasies that we don't necessarily have good reason to invent. But then there are some philosophers who say Occam's razor is for skeptards.
I was going to say some of what you're dealing with when you present that is, I don't know if it's timelines, but you're dealing with a real reality we all observe, and then like these potential realities that could have existed. And now you're back to the observation collapsing the wave function sort of thing, where you go from a probability, possibility into actuality. And that happens with the observation collapse. Tagging on that.
It's kind of
I get it. It's like the way of truth and reality versus the wave of fantasy and belief. Let's say, if to paraphrase it.
Yeah, that works. Sure.
Yeah, I think Parmenides had this effect on us. Speechless.
Sorry.
As opposed to
Yeah.
Heraclitus, where we could talk for hours.
Yeah. With Heraclitus, conversation
I would
flows.
break bread with him.
Yeah. They portray him, Heraclitus, as a kind of melancholic guy, but that could be just hearsay afterwards. While Parmenides, it doesn't seem like he had intense emotions. He was kind of seemed like a really poker face kind of guy. He was dealing with all this extremely groundbreaking metaphysics, the first metaphysics, supposedly, seemingly with a straight face, like it's just another Tuesday.
Seems very much a precursor to the Stoics later.
Yeah, the Stoics, honestly, they drew from so many sources, so many. When we get there, we can go through this, but they really were a convergence from many early Ionian, Spartan, other Hellenistic groups, etc., thinkers, maybe even indirectly from Buddhists. Anyway, I have nothing more to comment on this guy. He will probably make me think about this for quite some time, especially while I go through the studies of others, and I suppose it will be more or less the same for you guys. Maybe it's a nice time to round this up like a perfect complete sphere.
Yeah, I'm happy to wrap it up.
Yeah, no, I'm Parmenides. He said it all. But I'll kick it to Kara.
Okay. Well, guys, thank you all for coming here. Thank you for the amazing audience, Wolf Intrant, and everybody else who was silent but just listening to us attentively. Nerdalian, Rogerio, Graham, amazing. I learned a lot today, and see you next Saturday at 11, I guess, unified time. By the way, we will play off some of the start comments with unpublished work by Nerdalian.
Yeah, and together with Kara, I'm published, right? Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye all.